and welcome to Murder with Friends, the show where friends get together and talk about some of the darker sides of history. I'm your host, Grace Baldridge, and joining me today is the entire Murder with Friends team. So we have my co-creator, Amir, and our editors, Elle and Cassie, and what we're going to be doing today is a little bit of like a campfire edition. We've picked out stories, cases, figures that haunt us, that fascinate us, and we're just sharing with each other why and sharing with you. And Amir, all I know about who you will be presenting to us today is that it has something to do with a Mexican death cult from the 1960s?
Yes, that is correct, Grace.
Do enlighten me.
Okay, so this is the story of Magdalena Solis, also known as the High Priestess of Blood. She was a Mexican serial killer and also one of the few female serial killers that had a clear sexual motivation to commit her crimes, yeah.
Okay.
So we talked about Eileen Wuornos, and I don't think we came to the conclusion that it wasn't sexually motivated like a lot of serial killers, but for her, in this case, it was. Before we get into Magdalena, we got to start a little bit earlier with the Hernandez brothers. So Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, they were two petty criminals. They were brothers, and they were low on money. They were scam artists. They would go around Mexico kind of doing cheap tricks and whatever. Mm-hmm. Eventually, they came up with the brilliant idea to kind of start a cult, per se. It wasn't really a cult when it first started. It was just more of a scheme to get people to give them money.
Like a Herbalife sort of thing?
Yeah, like kind of like an Herbalife thing, but mixed in with kind of Mexican and like Incan mythology.
So like Scientology.
Yeah,
yes,
sure.
Like Scientology.
Exactly. So they came upon this small town called Yerba Buena, very small town with uneducated people, super poor, illiterate. And they proclaimed themselves to be prophets and high priests of a powerful and exiled Incan god. And immediately, these people believed them. And they said, if you come join us and listen to us, we will share with you our vast wealth and treasures which are hidden in these mountains around here.
Wait, why did they believe, like, why were they so quick to believe them?
Did they have technology on their travels?
No, this was 1962, and this was a very poor area of northern Mexico, and these guys were charismatic people, and they came in and they believed them. So
they were magicians.
Yeah, so they kind of took over this town of Yerba Buena, and this went on for a couple of months. And what it pretty much turned into was sexual slavery and abuse. They would basically have sex with whoever they wanted. They would have like these crazy orgies, and people would get abused in return.
What is the motivation there? What's the payoff for the townspeople?
The payoff was the idea of getting some kind of mythical power and also getting hidden treasures that would make them extremely wealthy.
Okay. There's obviously a generational and cultural disconnect as we're listening to this now.
Yeah, and this you gotta also believe that this is all part of Incan and Aztec mythology back then that a lot of these people believed in. So given that they were saying that they were these prophets and priests, like they took that in as, oh, this is just like what we were told as children. They're gonna give us all these rewards. Anyway, so this whole trickery by the Hernandez brothers kept going on until finally they weren't getting the treasures and everything. Mm-hmm. People were starting to get annoyed. So in order to keep their plan from failing, they went down to Monterey where they met Magdalena Solis, a prostitute at that time, along with her brother who was her pimp. So they brought them along for the ride. Now Magdalena also, she had a really shitty upbringing. She was a prostitute from the age of 12 years old. And you know the whole story about like that. So they brought her into this mix, and immediately...
Fortunately, I don't actually know the whole story about being a prostitute from the age of 12, but it sounds like
it never leads to anything good. So she was quick to join this whole cult that they had, and she quickly actually rose to the top of the cult. And these orgies got bigger, and the abuse got worse.
But they were traveling now. It was a traveling cult.
No, this was still in Yerba Buena.
Okay.
And they actually found a cave around there, which they set up like as their base of operations there. So they kept having these crazy orgies and abusing some of their victims until eventually two people decided, you know what, fuck this. I don't want anything else to do with this cult. And they were trying to leave. At this point, Magdalena had all of the members turn against these two people, and they lynched them right on the spot. So that was one. After that, for the next 6 weeks, they started getting into human sacrifice itself, usually with people who had any complaints with any of their tactics or.
And she was now sort of a leader in the cult.
She was the leader, the de facto leader.
How did she outrank the brothers that founded the cult?
That's a good question. So the brothers, like, they had all these issues. Everyone was starting to catch on to their whole plot. So they went and got Magdalena, and then when they brought her, using simple parlor tricks, like smoke and whatever, they brought her in, and they were like, this is the priestess that we've all been waiting for. This is the Incan god. She's here, the high priestess. And when these poor illiterate people saw this smoke, they were like, of course it is. So,
and why her? Did they just see something in her that they thought was compelling, or she proved her loyalty?
Yeah, they wanted to find someone like her who was a prostitute and who would be willing to be in cahoots with them.
Okay.
And they felt that they could trust her.
And they were just doing it for money.
Yeah.
They weren't getting into this to murder people.
Yeah. As she kind of consolidated this power, she also started getting bored with just having orgies. Because, I mean, come on. Orgies are super boring just by themselves. She started demanding human sacrifices. And she devised a blood ritual, which basically was brutally beating, burning, cutting, and maiming members of the cult that were starting to turn against it. And then they would bloodlet whoever they were going to kill, mix the blood with chicken blood, all the while consuming marijuana and peyote. And they would pass around this chalice with the blood, and they would each have a sip of it.
Why were people still listening to them?
Yeah.
This goes back to Aztec mythology, though. And a part of that Aztec mythology is, quote, the blood was the only decent food for the gods. This is from the Aztecs. Through it, they preserved their immortality. This was all part of this whole Aztec Incan kind of mythology that they were trying to sell.
But the cult cannot have grown, I guess, because I'm listening to this and I'm accepting that this is a culture that I don't understand.
Yeah, it was only around 50 people, most of the people in this small village, plus the Hernandez brothers, Magdalena and her brother.
And it just sounds like as soon as Magdalena assumed any form of power, she just started killing off members, dissenting members or members that she didn't like. So it can't have grown.
Right. Was there anyone left after
was there anyone left after about a month of this?
The butchering went on for about 6 weeks in 1963, and during that time, 4 people died, and by the end of it, the last 2 actually had their hearts cut out of their bodies while they were still alive.
And how was she caught? How did this end for her?
So, one night, May 1963, a 14-year-old local resident was out and about, as young boys do, playing outside, when he saw some lights in the distance on near where he lived. And he walks over and he sees a cave, and there he witnesses them committing one of the sacrifices. Freaked out as shit, he runs 17 miles to the nearest police station. And when he gets there, he's crying, he's sobbing, he can barely explain himself. And the way he actually does explain himself, this is a translation, is a group of murderers who prey on ecstasy, who were gluttonously drinking human blood like vampires, is how he explained them to the cops. The cops obviously laughed at him, told him to go home, whatever. But anyway.
Whoa, no, but anyway. What do you mean the police laughed at him?
So they laughed at him, but one of the cops was like, all right, kid, I will see what's happening, even though this is going to be a waste of time. So the next morning, he went with an officer, and the kid escorted him back to the cave where he saw this. That was the last time they were ever seen.
What?
Yeah, so a day later, once they realized that this officer is also gone, they took the matter much more seriously. So they sent a whole police force with the army to the cave, where they found the remains of the officer and the boy. The officer had his heart ripped out, and the boy had been dismembered.
And Magdalena?
Yeah, and they found Magdalena's brother there, and a shootout ensued, and he was killed. And then they found Magdalena and the Hernandez brothers at a farm nearby where they were arrested and sentenced to prison.
What were they doing at the farm? Were they hiding out, or did they just have a secret double life where they were just pleasantly farming?
I think that's where they lived, and they found them with a lot of marijuana.
And what about the rest of the followers? Because if the night before the boy had witnessed this ritual with a bunch of other followers.
So given that the followers were so into this cult, they actually never testified against anyone.
What?
Yeah, so they only got about 30 years. And she was only charged for 2 murders, even though they believe that she probably killed over 10 people. And the two were the boy and the officer.
So not the entire village wasn't part of the cult. It was just not like
There was a lot of people from the village involved in it.
a lot of people, but not everybody.
So even if the cult members didn't testify against the Hernandez brothers and Magdalena, it sounds to me like they found enough evidence in the cave to convict them for life. So why only 30 years? They just couldn't
I'm not sure
tie
how
them?
the laws work in Mexico.
What was she released from prison, or did she die behind bars?
She died behind bars.
Well, there's that.
It's just, I guess the part that kind of interested me the most about this is the kid. Like, imagine you're living your normal day, and you come upon this cave with a fucking blood ritual cult going on inside of it. It's something straight out of a horror, like a supernatural horror novel. And then you go run back, and then the cops are like, all right, you gotta take me back to this cave. And then that's it. They caught them and ripped their hearts out and drank their blood.
Yeah, a lot of times we hear about cases or figures where the police do not believe them initially. Especially, it seems to be when it's the most horrific thing. People reported John Wayne Gacy, and the police were like, no, he's such a nice guy. And it seems like with this as well, the police were like, that's such a crazy story, it couldn't possibly be true.
Right.
And I think that that's weird for me, and maybe it's just because this is a show about murder, but it's weird because the bad stuff is always easier for me to believe.
Right. Because, why would you make that up? Like, how could you even make that up?
Because you're a 14-year-old kid, and 14-year-olds never.
But they don't
believe.
like
You
running
ran
17 miles. Yeah, the 17 miles is quizzical. Like if I were a police officer,
it takes like a day to do, doesn't it?
it's almost a marathon. Yeah. Wow, that's crazy. I think what's really interesting is I would like to learn more about the court system and why she was not given a life sentence.
So they were sentenced to 50 years in prison for the two homicides, the boy and the cop, but they were not able to confirm their participation in the other 6 murders because all the cult members arrested refused to testify.
Okay, and then another follow-up question. What happened to these cult members? Did they just join another cult where they're like, oh, well, that's the end of that cult. Guess we'll move on to another one?
So a lot of the members were actually shot in a shootout when the police came because they were armed.
Oh, so it was
and
almost...
they barricaded themselves in the caves.
Sort of Jonestown-esque of
and then the ones that were
suicide.
arrested were sentenced to 30 years in prison.
Did they at least find the bodies of the other?
Yeah, they found at least 8 of the bodies. There could have been more, though.
So the ones that did survive ended up just going to prison anyways.
Yeah.
So no
They
wonder
were
why they didn't.
complicit in...
Yeah, no wonder why they didn't tell the police anything.
Yeah, they were already going away.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's human sacrifice is just really a fascinating concept in general, and I think it does still happen in some places. I mean, albeit a lot less,
Yeah.
of course, but the fact that we went through that and we thought that killing people and like the idea of blood is going to satiate like some kind of god is just, it's unbelievable.
What was the deal with Magdalena? Like, does she believe that she is like a messenger of God or a priestess, or was she crazy?
I think she was a very sadistic, psychopathic individual, and she finally had the opportunity to release those urges in a setting like this.
I mean, she was a prostitute at 12 years old. She was
Yeah.
powerless, and now all of a sudden she gets this power and revenge
Yeah.
after this entire life. I could kind of see
Yeah, and
why
while
she-
being propped up as a god.
Yeah.
It sort of reminds me of other stories we've told before, like with Charles Manson, when you have someone that is extremely manipulative and you mix them together with people who are extremely vulnerable and looking for a savior or an explanation for the life that they've been dealt, it can create a perfect storm that in this case and in other cases we've talked about results in murder and results in the ultimate sort of depravity and
Yeah, plus as someone who was a prostitute, like she was powerless her whole life. All of a sudden, the power is in her hands.
and this is what she does with it.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that is. How do you want to call this one, Amir? What should we call it? A Mexican death cult?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's the story. That's the story of Magdalena Solis and the Mexican death cult. Had you heard about this story before? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel, and we'll see you next time on Murder with Friends. Bye.